Can one ever have enough wooden cutting boards? Face grain, edge grain, end grain, so many options. And I went with 2 of them to make these 2 beautiful cutting boards. And I will show you how I did it. Do you want one too? Follow me and lass uns anfangen.
There's dirt on my hands, strong like a tree. There's roots where I stand.
If you feel like you have seen these lumber cherry boards before, this is correct. This project was built out of lumber that I recently purchased for one of my previous videos. I still have a few more boards left for more projects. For now, let's start with building those 2 beautiful cutting boards. I started by chopping the boards to size by using my miter saw. I went with 2 different styles, an edge grain cutting board and an end grain cutting board. The edge grain cutting board I like to use for cutting vegetables because they are usually very juicy. Just think cutting tomatoes. For my steak and barbecue, I built an end grain cutting board. It's just so traditional to use a butcher block style boards for meats. Also, it will show cut marks less and keep the knife sharp for longer. Both boards have their pros and cons, but this combo works well for me. End grain is usually more expensive style of board since it takes much longer to build since it has an additional glue up step. Have you ever noticed the amount of finishing oil that an end grain board sucks in versus the amount an edge grain needs? You will be surprised. The end grain feels like a sponge that takes in so much oil, which usually results in a much deeper color in the end. So besides of the pro and con list on both style boards, you will also have the option to decide on how deep and rich of a color outcome you would like to have. As I picked out the lumber pieces at the store, I went through the whole pile to find the pieces with the most sapwood. I really enjoy the lighter color variations. That makes the wood board so much more interesting. Of course, sapwood is younger, softer, and less durable than the hardwood. But honestly, I have never had an issue using it with cutting board builds, and I have built a lot of them. I wanted the boards just to be over 4 cm thickness, or around 1 3/4 inch. So in the future, when I like to refinish the boards, I have some room to do it, without ending up with a too thin board. When you cut the strips to size, make sure you add a little bit more, since you will lose some of the thickness when you surface the boards after the glue up. There's always one that does not like to stand in line, and you will end up having to shave down the surface until you're fully level. So plan in a little bit more thickness. I started by gluing up the side grain cutting board. Like usually, I decided to go with my Tidebond 3 glue, and I like to use a lot of it. You will do the same if you ever build a cutting board and you tighten the clamps and you notice you don't get an even squeeze out. Actually, you get no squeeze out, and then you notice the wood sucked up the glue and now there's not enough. So make sure you use enough wood glue. Let's look for the beautiful glue squeeze out. Perfect. While this was drying, I tackled the end grain cutting board glue up, spread the glue, and tighten the clamps. Then I let both boards dry overnight. I could have glued up the end grain the same way I glued up the edge grain, and then cut it to build the end grain, but I wanted to get a different kind of pattern, so I went with this glue up technique instead. I think this glue up is a little bit harder to work with, but well worth the time investment. The next day it was time to level the surface of the boards. Take off any excess glue and end up with a surface ready to sand. Usually I like to use my planer for this, but my planer only takes board up to 12 inches and those boards are much wider. So now there are a few options. Use a router sled, a drum sander, belt sander, or a CNC machine. As you can tell, I went with the CNC. I'm taking off just enough to remove any imperfections. Unfortunately, my dust boot is broken and I don't want to purchase another one because this CNC machine is ready to retire. Just have to save up a little bit more money to get something that actually works. However, it still does a good enough job to level surfaces. Now you can start seeing the beautiful pattern coming through. I just love the details of the sapwood. The edge grain still has another glue up step before I can level the surface, so I went ahead and sanded the end grain for now. And like always, let's have fun with it. After a break, I tackled the glue out that will become the end grain board. Using my table saw, I cut them in just about 4 cm thick slices. Usually, I like to use my cross-cut sledge, but the board was too long for it, so it has to do without. As I glued up the boards, I made every piece the same width, besides the end piece. This piece was half the width of the other pieces. Like this, you end up with a nicer pattern in the end once you organize the pieces for the final glue up. I rotated every other piece to end up with this pattern. And then you know the drill for the glue up. Tidebond 3, use enough glue, spread it evenly, and then tighten the clamps just enough to get an even squeeze out. Once the glue has fully dried, I used my CNC again to surface the board. Once all this was done, I added a groove underneath each board to make it easier to pick it up from the counter. These boards are not light, and it's a nice feature to have. I also added a juice groove into the end grain cutting board, so meat juices don't just run all over the place. Those are the screws for the hands I was talking about. What do you think? Do you like that feature? The edges were still way too sharp, so I used my router to chamfer the edges to a 45-degree angle. And then it was time for the final round of sanding. That is, if the sanding disc will stick. Let's try this one more time. Yeah, maybe not. I definitely need a new sanding pad for my sander. For now, I made it work. Are you wondering why I spray water on the wood? Well, it got really hot and needed to cool down. Just kidding. The water is to raise the grain on the wood. I applied a thin coat, let it dry, and then I sanded it one more time to take off any raised grain to end up with a super smooth board. I did that on both sides and for both boards. And then it was time for the finish. And of course, I'm using MeikeMade liquid hydration wood oil for the best finish. I apply a generous amount of oil. Let the wood soak in as much oil as it likes for a few hours or better overnight. Then come back and wipe off any excess. After, apply a thin layer of mousse Margousse wood butter for a silky smooth finish. Use a lint-free cloth, add some butter, and rub it in circular motion. You want to do a really good job here and work the butter in very well. Don't leave out any spots and apply an even coat. After all, the finish takes a big role in the outcome of your product. Silky smooth, the perfect food-safe finish. I buffed it one more time, and then it was time to attach the rubber legs to keep the boards from sliding around the countertop. For this, I built a little jig to space the rubber legs evenly on all 4 sides. Usually I always pre-drill the holes, but this time I used smaller screws, so I did not feel like I had to. And it worked out just fine. And wir fertig! Wow, what a project! I absolutely love my new cutting boards. I can't wait to start cooking. But then again, they're so nice, I don't even want to use them. The first cut on a brand new cutting board is always the hardest one to make. But once you start, you can't stop cutting. I will definitely enjoy using those. Which one is your favorite? The edge grain or the end grain? I just can't make up my mind. Like always, please like, comment and subscribe. Most importantly, press the bell button to get notified of new videos. If you can, please join my Patreon. This helps me create more YouTube videos. Thank you so much for your support and see you next Friday. Tschüss!